Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Castlevania Bloodlines / Vampire Killer / Castlevania The Next Generation, depends on where you're from really. In the last part, we started off the game and now we're heading off to Stage 3, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, because this game's environment variety is just so good, I love it. The only other Castlevania games that have this kind of variety in their area aesthetics is... That's actually a tough question. I guess technically, like Symphony of the Night and Aria Sorrow can get a bit out there, but at the same time, they're all very similar once you get to the Metroidvanias. Order of Ecclesia, I guess, is also relatively high up there. Now, something I usually do, but I didn't last part because I just had so much else to talk about, is this game's manual. Because the manual does a pretty good job of explaining this game's plot, but it also brings up a very interesting character who's only ever brought up in the manual. They don't appear in the game at all. So let's see, to start, journey back to 1897 in the Transylvanian countryside of Romania. It was a time of fear and dread for the simple people of this European country. They lived under the dark rule of Count Dracula for many years. He was a ruthless warrior when he was alive, but he was even more terrifying in death, for you see, Dracula is the king of vampires. Ooh, scary, shocking. But even one as powerful as Dracula has enemies. From the early 16th century, the Belmonts, including Trevor, Christopher, and Simon, had been fighting Dracula and his minions throughout Europe. Christopher, I believe, is from one of the Game Boy games, from my memory? Finally, in 1897, Quincy Morris, a descendant of the House of Belmont, overcame great odds to defeat Dracula and sent him to his eternal grave, referencing the Bram Stoker novel more than anything. By the way, that's the swinging thing I brought up with John that you could do last part, just swing diagonally midair and hopefully you'll latch onto the ceiling. You do damage with your kick while you're going, and I believe otherwise you're invincible, but it is surprisingly hard to control, because you might swing weirdly like that. Unfortunately, since Quincy was so badly beaten in his battle with the Count, he lost his own life moments after plunging a wooden stake into Dracula's chest. Also, it's weird to see a bone dragon as a mini-boss, might I add. Quincy's legacy has continued, however. His son, John Morris, and John's childhood friend Eric Lecard, had witnessed the Quincy-Dracula showdown from the shadows. That scene changed their lives forever. As they grew older, they swore to rid the planet of the evil creatures of the underworld. 20 years later, Elizabeth Bartley, the name conjures up images of a regal countess who, in the year 1421, was found kneeling over the body of a dead young man. He had 2 puncture wounds in his neck. She was tried as a vampire and found guilty. Her sentence was too gruesome to mention in these pages. What is important is that she was indeed guilty. And not only was she a vampire, she was the niece of Count Dracula. Also, this screen sucks, because what's below us is now a bottomless pit, and the Medusa heads like to knock you back so far you fall from basically anywhere into it. This is arguably my least favorite stage in the game, just due to this section and the next one. Now in the ruins of a mysterious castle in Transylvania, an amateur witch by the name of Drolta Zuentes dabbles in arcane magic. She casts a spell which inadvertently brings Elizabeth Bartley back to the land of the living. Now that she has returned, Bartley is bent toward one goal, reviving her dead uncle, Count Dracula. In a twist of fate, Morris and Lecard have been drawn towards the ominous castle. Their task is simple: defeat Bartley before she can complete her macabre objective. Completing their task, however, will involve many perilous encounters and life or death acts of bravado. Is your heart strong enough for this challenge? Okay, so that sounds relatively standard for a game of this type from the late 80s into early 90s. Some dark stuff in there, but relatively tame. In Japan, there are a lot of differences to this game's background. Mostly with Bartley herself. Her death date was completely different in Japan. She died in 1614, the exact year her basis, the person she's based on, Elizabeth Bathory, actually died. She resurrected 300 years later, and her first action after coming back, she was so pissed at humanity that she jump-started World War I by assassinating the Crown Prince of Austria. She killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Oh dear, that's delightfully crazy. Additionally, I think Eric's backstory was a little bit different. I think his girlfriend was turned into a vampire. I forget if it was by Bartley directly or just in general. Whereas I believe John's backstory was more or less the same. Okay, now the first scrolling section within the tower could be annoying, but this is potentially worse depending on who you are. We have 3 straight scrolling sections here. One left, one up, and then one right. The platforms themselves are relatively safe. In fact, you can't even easily fall off them without knockback, and during these sections in particular, getting hit is often going to knock you back onto another one. The enemies here are the biggest annoyance though, especially if I'm trying to keep my fully powered whip/spear, because the little skeleton gargoyles, the way they work is that they come on screen, they circle you once or twice, and then they go straight at you, at which point is probably the best time to hit them. However, it's just really hard to time. The good news is about the gargoyles, as you've seen several times, is that they are likely to drop gems or even sub-weapons. They're your candles for this section, because having candles standing on moving walls like that, or rather non-existent walls like this, now that I think about it, is a little bit odd. Although I guess now I think about it, those enemies weren't gargoyles, because this is a gargoyle. This boss likes to fly off-screen and do 3 different attacks. It'll slam its tail down like that, trying to hit you. It'll hold it over to the opposite side of the screen where it is, where it'll fire 3 of its tail sections at you. After about a third of its health, well, after each third of its health, actually, it circles around the tower and then dashes to the opposite side, in which case, on the first go-around, it'll repeat its prior pattern. On the third go-around, though, its pattern changes completely. It's going to try and slam itself into you on the tower like so. That is surprisingly hard to dodge depending on where you are, because the annoying thing about this fight is the Tower of Pisa itself. It's constantly rotating, and because of that, you're constantly being moved left or right. You can even see it happening right here while I'm waiting for the boss to die. You'll never fall off the platform because it's rotating around, not like shifting left to right. So you're more or less just moving in the 3D space of the background. But still, that'll very easily drag you into one of the boss's attacks if you're not careful. Also, damn, that's a T-pose. Now we're moving on to stage 4, which is probably the stage I first think of when I think of this game. Mostly because it kind of sticks out amongst the rest of the stages. Because a lot of these other ones are historical sites, or Castlevania itself. This one's just a munitions factory in the middle of Germany because World War I. On that topic of World War I, though, this is one of the, not exactly few spin-offs in Castlevania, but one of the few games in Castlevania that's not connected to the Belmonts directly that got a direct sequel. Portrait of Ruin on the DS is a sequel to this game, because the villain of that game, without saying too much, World War I harmed him directly, and Eric Lacard's family is even partially a part of that game's plot line. And of course, I think you play as Jonathan's kid, if I'm recalling correctly. I actually forget the plot line to an extent of Portrait of Ruin. I haven't played the game through all the way, 8 years, maybe? I forget the exact amount. Either way, it's been a long, long time. It's a good game, but it's not my favorite in the DS trilogy. That goes to either Order of Ecclesia or Dawn of Sorrow. Alright, now, progress is to the left, but there is an entirely optional side pathway here to the top left of the stage that Eric can get to either by jumping, or rather, Eric can get to by using his Mega Jump, or if you're playing as Jonathan, you can do very careful swings from the far right of the screen. I've only ever nailed those jumps maybe once. It is deceptively difficult to do, at least with the way I play these games. And I've always just had trouble controlling Jonathan's swinging. It's part of the reason, if I'm playing this game, I'm more often than not playing as Eric, because if I want to play as, like, a Belmont-like, I can just play Castlevania 1 or 4. 3 as well, but that's, even though I love 3, it's my favorite out of the original trilogy, particularly if I'm playing the Japanese version. It's just harder for me to go back to. It's the whole Final Fantasy IX thing, where I like it more than 7, but I go back to 7 more because I like to savor 9. And I need to be in a bit more of a specific mood for it. The main gimmick with this stage overall is conveyor belts and various conveyor belt-like objects that push you and pull you all over the place. Honestly, the best analog to make about this area is that it's the clock tower for the game. Because later on in it, we're even going to have the usual little gears you walk on, even some little buzzsaw-like things. So, I guess that is the purpose of this stage, is to fulfill that kind of trope. We also have random giant pistons that I don't understand the purpose of. They act as platforms when they're moving, so you can carefully use that to your advantage if you're playing correctly. The big thing to note, though, is that they are one of the few instances in this game I can think of where you can get crushed to death. So, make sure that doesn't happen. Overall, though, they're not too threatening. Hey, there's the clock tower I know and love, I think. Honestly, the more I think about Castlevania stage gimmicks, the clock tower is usually the most annoying. It definitely is in Symphony of the Night, particularly in the Inverse Castle. Just because, goddamn, those yellow Medusa heads. Ugh. Even with the mirror armor, it's just tedious to get some of those bonuses. It's not too bad in Aria of Sorrow. It's damaging, but if you have ways to manage the spike damage or just get around it in general, it's not that bad. Medusa heads still suck, though. Castlevania 3 probably has the easiest clock tower now that I think about it, because it's the second stage in the game, I believe, if you take that path away. And then you have to go back through it backwards, because then you got Grant. I love the stage's theme as well, by the way. I know I haven't commented on the music too much besides the fact it's good in general, outside of the Castlevania 1 through 2 and 3 representative songs, but this soundtrack is really kick-ass. It has that definitive Genesis sound without being too twangy. The best comparison I can make for it is that it is like Wily Tower from Mega Man: The Wily Wars, where if you keep in mind the sound chip and design music for it correctly, it sounds amazing. Don't get me wrong, I think the Super Nintendo overall had the better music chip, because there's no way they could do Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack on this. They may have been able to do Final Fantasy IV, maybe. Honestly, I don't know. Did Uematsu ever do a game on the Genesis, actually? Now I'm curious. Doesn't look like it from a quick Google search, which kind of sucks, but oh well. Also, mini-boss for this stage is the creature. This fight is deceptively hard because it has the most attacks out of any mini-boss I can think of in the game. It has two involving its little whip, one where he'll circle around and hit basically the half of the screen directly in front of him. One where he shoots his thing straight across technically the top of the bottom third of the screen, and then an electric wave that goes across the bottom. With Eric, there's not much to fear there, but with John, there's a good amount of distance you need to make sure you're keeping track of there, and it's surprisingly difficult. And now we have buzzsaws. Some of these, you need to walk under every single one of them, but some of them you will need to duck about halfway, if not less, under, just so you can make it under without getting damaged. You could, of course, just take the hit and pure victory your way to it, just by completely ignoring it and saying, haha, I'll take the damage. I know I can beat the boss without it, because we're not the boss yet, we're about 3 screens away, I think, but we're getting there. Now, something that's interesting about this particular game is that I think out of all of the games I've done on the channel, this is the only one I think where we know about 2 different prototype releases for the game that were found through eBay listings and such. One was version 0.1, which I think only has a couple of the stages, completely different graphical effects, just some weird gimmicks in general, like instead of having the powered-up sub-weapons by pressing up and C, there was an item to upgrade them, which did the exact same thing. World map is gone, so on and so forth. And then there's the December 93 prototype, which is much closer to the... I think it's actually a prototype of the PAL release, which is just different. Like, I think Konami Code will introduce a level select instead of expert mode. The sound still plays when Eric gets impaled, so they're working on the changes. It's weird. Not often do we see that many different prototypes for a game that's not an RPG. Back on topic, though, time for the boss fight. This is the Gear Steamer. This is arguably the most complex fight in the game, because what it does depends on its relative size, which changes depending on where in its pattern it is and how many times you've hit it. The more you hit it, the smaller it gets. It can jump all over the place, fling gears all over the place, fly across the middle of the screen, in which case you can either just jump up high or duck beneath it. It has a couple different charge attacks, but it'll charge across the bottom of the screen and then jump up. Generally speaking, to avoid those, you just can either jump over it if it's small enough, like this. I think I could technically just mega jump over it with Eric, and just jumping up on the higher platforms. This is a fun fight, and it really showcases a lot of what the Genesis could do in terms of these weird little floating effects. Similarly to some of the bosses in Gunstar Heroes. Even the Armor Battler had some of that going on. I don't recall the Super Nintendo ever doing anything like this, so it's just cool to see it being used to its effectiveness. Mind you, I will say one thing, the Genesis is one of its few true 3D games. That one racing game definitely ran better than Star Fox. because the Super FX chip was slow. This boss fight, though, it does reset its pattern once you're in the last, like, fourth of its health, but if you're fast enough, it doesn't get much of a chance to do anything. Easy boss fight, but a fun one. But with that and us finishing off the munitions factory, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're gonna go take on the final stages of the game. Very few stages in this game compared to the other ones, but they're longer to make up for it. Thank you guys for watching, and see you guys then.